We are all here because God has called us into ministry. And as we sit here training to go do a very important work, there's some nerves that come along. See, I'm not sure if we vocalize it a whole lot, but as we train for ministry, I think we find this stress point as we learn what it means to be both a Christian, just your everyday Christian, and a minister, this vocational ambassador role. How do we deal with that tension? It's got me asking questions like, does God want something from us that he doesn't want from other people, or more from us than from other people? Will we lead people astray if we sin? Will I still be employed if my relationship with God is on the rocks? And will God punish me harder because of my sin? Or maybe will God discredit my whole ministry if I mess up? Now, unfortunately, I'm not actually going to answer all those questions today because A, I don't have time, and B, I genuinely don't know the answer to some of those. But I am going to kind of go down that line, and I'm going to ask the basic question: how does God view me? How does God respond to me when I fail in ministry, or when I'm wrong in ministry, or when I misunderstand in ministry? So I've got a few different questions, and I'm going to start off with a simple one. How does he view and respond to us when we fail, when we actually mess up, or when we do something wrong or get something wrong like that? So I'd like you to turn to Mark 9 for this one. Mark 9 verses 14 through 18, or you can just listen along as well because we're going to bob around a little bit. And as you read with me, I'd like you to kind of just notice the disciples' failure. Notice the context leading up to it. So I'll read starting in verse 14. When they came to the disciples, they saw a large crowd around them and scribes disputing with them. When the whole crowd saw him, they were amazed and ran to meet him. He asked them, "What are you arguing with them about?" Someone from the crowd answered him, "Teacher, I brought my son to you. He has a spirit that makes him unable to speak, and whenever it seizes him, it throws him down, and he foams at the mouth, grinds his teeth, and becomes rigid. I asked your disciples to drive it out, but they could not." Now, I don't know about you, but that last line scares me just a little bit. Because these men, unlike we do walk with Jesus, but they literally walked with physical, incarnate Jesus, and they couldn't get this demon out of this man. Charged with ministry, sent out twice, and they can't get this demon out of this man. What happens if that's us? We all dream of having an effective ministry, but what happens when it isn't? What happens when someone comes hurting, looking for help, like the man in the story, but leaves broken, leaves without help? And more importantly, does God look down at us for that? Is God watching us and disappointed that we couldn't help? Does God want us out of a job for all this? I don't think so. And here's two comforting things I want to show you from this text and what we see unfold next about how God responds to our failures in ministry. The first, and this is kind of the most important one, is I want to show you that even when the disciples failed to help this man, Jesus didn't. So we can kind of take a load off. Jesus is the one that responds after we fail, even to help the person we failed with. When we fail someone, when we try our best but they still leave discouraged, when we preach our best but it still doesn't click, when we love our best but they still leave, or pray our hardest and they still get sick, Jesus still provides for them. And we can't, or when we can't, or when we simply won't, or maybe we don't, Jesus can and will provide for them. God is still in control and still has a plan. So take a load off. When we fail, Jesus still has that person. Secondly, though, and addressing a little bit more of us, if we turn to verse 28 and 29, Jesus says, after he had healed the man and the disciples came to him, the disciples are probably a little down here, and they ask, "Why couldn't we drive the spirit out?" And Jesus doesn't condemn them, but rather answers them, "This kind can only be cast out by prayer." And I won't dive into the theology of what that means. We actually got it this morning. But what's important is this. When we fail, and when our ministry is ineffective, Jesus comes alongside us and doesn't condemn us, but teaches us and guides us and points us towards the truth. Okay, so Jesus is quick to teach us when we fail. But here's a slightly different question, a little nuanced question. How does Jesus respond when we make the mistake of forgetting how powerful he is? Not mistrusting who he is, but saying, "Here's Jesus. I'm not recognizing how powerful he could be in this situation." We all have times in ministry where we come to the end of ourselves. We need the work of Jesus. We need people to see Jesus when they're in distress. And our ministry desperately needs Jesus through and through. But what happens if we forget about how powerful Jesus is? What happens if the person comes in and you question if Jesus is actually powerful enough to change them in this circumstance? How does Jesus respond when we make the mistake of forgetting how powerful he is? Flip back a couple chapters to Mark 4, and I think we're going to see an example here. Mark 4, verse 35 through 41. Popular story. I'll begin reading in verse 35. On that day, when the evening had come, he told them, "Let's cross over to the other side." So they left the crowd and took him along, and since he was in the boat, and other boats were with him, a great windstorm arose, and the waves were breaking over the boat, so that the boat was already being swamped. And he was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. So they woke him up and said, "Teacher, teacher, don't you care that we're going to die?" And he got up, and he rebuked the waves, and he said to the sea, "Silence, be still." And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. And then he said to them, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" And they were terrified and asked one another, "Who then is this, that even the wind and the seas obey him?" Now in this story, we see the disciples running to Jesus when the waves come, but they didn't trust Jesus because they were afraid and wanting to find Jesus for safety because they thought they were going to die. So they still ran to Jesus, but they underestimated his power. They didn't trust Jesus when the waves came in. And we're going to have waves in our ministry. So what happens if we don't trust Jesus when someone tries to tear the church apart? And what happens if we don't trust Jesus in the face of an unhealthy elders board? What happens when 2 members of your church staff disqualify themselves from ministry in just a month? What happens if we don't trust Jesus as someone lies about our church, spreads information, and messes everything up? What happens when the waves come and we make the mistake of forgetting who Jesus is and how powerful he is? Well, take a look back at the story with me. The disciples forget the power of God, yet they still run to Jesus and ask for help. And look at what Jesus does. He does kind of give them a little smack on the wrist. He says, why are you worried? But he still calms the winds, and he still calms the seas. And here's the important piece. Yes, Jesus calmed the waves and fixed their problem, but what's more important is that when Jesus calmed the waves, he proved to the disciples that he was powerful enough to be trusted. So what happens when we make this mistake of not trusting Jesus' power in our ministry? Well, I believe Jesus is probably going to teach us to trust him so long as we keep running to him. As long as we are in active pursuit of seeking out Jesus, he's going to show us his power. Jesus is a restorer in this sense. The disciples may have feared in vain, but they still ran to Jesus. So in ministry, we may make the mistake of not recognizing how much he can do. And when the waves come, we may make the mistake of thinking that we are sinking and that hope is lost. But yet, when we run to Jesus, even in confusion of how powerful he is, he instructs us and teaches us to trust him more. When we make the mistake of not fully recognizing his power, he corrects us. So we've now seen 2 instances where Jesus responds to our failures positively, or at least he might not be happy about them, but he's got a restorative mind. He's not condemning. He's building us up to be better teachers and better leaders in his ministry. Was there ever a time when this wasn't the case? When Jesus didn't take this restorative approach, but rather he condemned leaders? And the answer is yes. And I'd like you to turn a couple chapters forward to Mark 7. This story, we're going to hear some introduction for the story of where we are, and then we're going to hear some text from Isaiah that Jesus is actually using prophetically to talk about the Pharisees. So listen as I begin in verse 1. The Pharisees and some of the scribes who had come from Jerusalem gathered around him, and they observed that some of the disciples were eating bread with unclean, that is, unwashed hands. The Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they give their hands a ceremonial washing, keeping the tradition of the elders. And when they came from the marketplace, they don't eat unless they have washed. And there were many other customs that they have received and kept, like the washing of cups, pitchers, kettles, and dining couches. So the Pharisees and the scribes asked him then, why don't your disciples live according to the traditions of the elders, instead of eating bread with ceremonially unclean hands? And Jesus answered them, Isaiah prophesied correctly about you hypocrites. As it's written, the people honor me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. and they worship me in vain, teaching as doctrines human commands. Abandoning the command of God, you hold on to the human tradition instead. See, while Jesus responded positively or in a restorative manner to the disciples, he quickly condemned the teachers of the law. So the question then becomes, what is it about these people that made Jesus condemn them rather than build them up? And the answer is in that Isaiah text that Jesus prophesied about. The answer is their heart. The disciples throughout this whole ordeal, though they keep failing and failing, they've been following Jesus. They mess up, Jesus corrects them, and they keep literally and figuratively following Jesus. But the teachers of the law are not doing this. And it's not that they weren't quite literally following him physically, but their hearts were not following Jesus, nor even the law that they already had. Their hearts were not for God. Thus, they used their position to create new laws, and they used it to sit at the best seats and to honor themselves. They created human traditions rather than actually showing people the laws of God and the heart behind them. And thus, surely this isn't a totally black and white statement, but in general, when someone has a heart for God but fails at teaching, when someone has a heart for God but fails at teaching, Jesus, like he does with the disciples, teaches and guides, reorients, restores, so that they can become better teachers and leaders. But when someone teaches well and lacks a heart for God, Jesus calls them hypocrites and condemns them. Let me say it again. When we have hearts for God, but yet we fail at teaching, God's going to restore our teaching. But when we teach well, but we fail to have a heart for God, God condemns us. So while I'm sure there's many more questions that we have about this new role that we're going into in this vocation of ministry that comes with so much, I want to either comfort you or warn you today that if you are here training for ministry and your heart is not on following God, but rather on anything else, don't freak out too much. I've been there. We've all been there. But it's important and imperative that we make the choice to come back to God and reorient our priorities around following Jesus. Because if we don't, our teaching may very well be critiqued as hypocritical by Jesus. Our seeming words of praise from the pulpit could be worship in vain. So as we prepare for ministry, don't get legalistic about it, but do ask yourself, where's my heart at? Or rather, what am I following right now? Am I following Jesus or am I following anything else? And if your heart is centered on anything other than God, or if you find yourself truthfully following a path that is not the person of Jesus himself, then don't wait. Today, reorient yourself. Spend time in prayer, repentance, and decide to follow after Jesus. You might have to do this a whole lot in your ministry because it's not a one-time decision. But it's worthwhile to ensure that as you lead others, you're being led by Jesus. And on the flip side of this, if your heart is genuinely for God, if you're following Jesus and his convictions for your life daily, then I see the pattern in the Bible tell us that he's actually going to respond positively to your failures. That he is actually going to build you up when you fail, developing you into the leader that he wants you to be, offering forgiveness and grace just like he does with the disciples. I believe he will continually restore you and reorient your heart, teaching you to be a better and more faithful ambassador for the Lord wherever you go. So as we train for ministry and we begin to feel the nervousness of this work, as we begin to question if God wants more from us than from other Christians or if we're judged harder, my advice to you today would be to make sure that you and your heart are in this for Jesus, that you and your heart are following Jesus. Because when we have hearts for God but fail at teaching, God restores our teaching. But when we have hearts that are really good at teaching, but our hearts aren't for God, he condemns us. That's it.